My mom was diagnosed with cancer right before COVID hit. We spent most of 2020 watching from a distance as she fought cancer alone. Because of the pandemic, we weren't allowed to visit her in the care facility where she was living. One time, my brother and I were sitting on lawn chairs that had been soaked by the sprinkler system, trying to have a conversation with her through her screened window. An orderly snuck us in for a secret visit. That was one of my few happy memories of 2020. In August, we finally got to visit my mom for real, but it was only because she decided to forego additional treatment and entered hospice care that we were finally allowed into her room. On August 22nd, 2020, my mom joined my dad, who had died over 20 years ago. They say when you lose both parents, you join the Orphan Club. Losing your parents after they've had a chance to raise you is a natural progression in life. Being abandoned on an orphanage doorstep is not. That's how I first joined the Orphan Club. Sometime in May 1976, just days after my birth, I was dropped off on an orphanage doorstep in Seoul, South Korea. The orphanage named me Shin Kyung Ok and sent me to a foster mom while I awaited placement with a new family. Meanwhile, my soon-to-be mother, halfway across the world, was carrying around a small black and white photograph of the perfect little Asian baby girl she was waiting to welcome home from Korea. I arrived in the United States on September 30th, 1976. After crossing an ocean and a country on a plane full of screaming orphans, being dropped off with their new families in cities all across the country, I finally met my new family at JFK Airport. By the time my mom picked up her perfect little Asian baby girl, I was screaming, crying, inconsolable. That anger I felt coming off the plane fueled temper tantrums my entire childhood. I used to slam my bedroom door so hard it would bounce back open and put a hole in the wall. My parents fixed it, and I did it again. They eventually just stopped fixing it. I was terrible to my big brother. One time, I took his precious Legos and I threw them in the toilet. And as he watched in horror and disbelief, this perfect little Asian baby girl flushed them down. I pushed the boundaries of my new family's love in every way. I think I was testing them to see if they would abandon me the way my first family did. Because although I didn't know what it meant to be adopted, I knew my family had abandoned me on that doorstep, and I was terrified that my new family would do the same. I was so scared when my parents left because I didn't know if they would come back. And even well into adulthood, I would get this panicky feeling when I went to use the restroom because I was afraid I might come back and they'd be gone. Despite that fear and anger, I had what was probably by most standards a fairly typical white American middle-class childhood in upstate New York. And I say white because I didn't view myself as Korean or Asian. My parents didn't either. They just assumed that if they treated me the same way they treated my brother, their biological son, the others would do the same. That would turn out not to be the case. But growing up in my white American family, in white American neighborhoods, I had no idea that the way I saw myself and the way my family saw me was not the way the rest of the world would always see me. Then, when I was 12, my dad retired, and my parents relocated from upstate New York to rural Oregon, to a small town outside of Coos Bay with a population barely over 1,000. That town was suffering from the decline of logging and fishing. It was and still is far from the progressive community I had known in New York. It's a town that rejects outsiders, immigrants, and people of color. I represented all three. The town rejected me. That ignorant bliss of no racial identity was quickly replaced with confusion, self-loathing, and an extreme identity crisis. And that anger that fueled temper tantrums throughout my childhood was quickly redirected to self-defense. Going into high school, I was bullied on a daily basis. I literally had a line of girls waiting to fight me. I didn't understand it. I was being called things like chink and gook, as if those terms had any meaning to me. But I didn't feel any connection to Asia or to Korea. All I knew then was that it was a source of pain and shame, and I tried to rid myself of it. I spent most of high school just trying to hide who I was, dyeing my hair as blonde as I could get it, wearing colored contacts, just trying to fit in. Looking back, I looked ridiculous. The school administration wasn't helpful, and my parents, as well-intentioned, good white folks, could not and did not understand what racism looked like, and they could not comprehend that their baby girl would fall victim to it. As I transitioned from girl to woman, I encountered another identity that I had never experienced before. I started to experience the fetishism that comes with being an Asian woman. One day, I was on the school bus. I was a freshman. A senior boy sat down next to me. He pulled out a knife, called me a gook, told me, "Go back to China," and then he proceeded to try and kiss and grope me. I was so confused at this mix of loving and loathing being directed at me solely because of my race. One day, the bullying stopped, but it was only because my parents went out and hired a lawyer. And it was at that moment I realized that one person had the power to change the course of my life in such an extraordinary way. I wanted that power for myself and to help others. So now I had a goal: to get out, become a lawyer, and never go back to that town. As an Asian American woman, I was told early on, you don't fit the image of a lawyer. I've heard you don't look like a lawyer my entire career, from my career services advisor to my Uber driver. So I set out to prove them wrong. I did what was expected of me. I worked hard to excel academically. I graduated from law school at the top of my class with a top job. From the outside looking in, my life looked flawless and my path seamless. But although I was bound and determined to prove that I could be a lawyer, I never really stopped to think, who am I as a person? I kept this charade up for a long time, just pretending to be the lawyer that other people thought I couldn't be. And although my career as a lawyer was thriving, I was falling apart inside. I came to a point where I was completely lost. I fell into a state of deep depression. My only sense of control was through an obsessive compulsive eating disorder. Each morning, I would step on the scale and I would weigh myself. And I would change my clothes until I saw a number I could live with. That number kept getting smaller and smaller until I ended up in St. Vincent's Hospital in a treatment program with no recognition of who I was. Coming out of that program, I had to rebuild my body, my career, my life, and for the first time, my identity. I have struggled with my various identities throughout my life and feeling at odds with all of them. But eventually, I found comfort in that ambiguity and contradiction. And in some ways, I've even learned to thrive in it. I've come to terms with being a Korean who has no connection to Korea, an Asian who didn't grow up culturally Asian, an Asian American who doesn't feel Asian or American, an immigrant who came involuntarily, a person of color who grew up white, and an Asian American woman who was told I would not fit in to a profession dominated by white men. My path from orphanage doorstep to here has not been seamless. I have stumbled along the way. But in 2020, before my mom passed, she was able to see her little baby Asian girl become president of the Oregon State Bar. The first Asian American and the first woman of color to be president. And so now I can proudly and confidently stand here and say, this is what a lawyer looks like. And this is who I am. With my mom's passing, I've come full circle. I'm truly learning to walk in the world without parents. I've joined the Orphan Club again. One of the last things my mom said to me before she died was, I wish I had told you more about the house. I was super confused about the comment. The last thing on my mind was where the circuit breaker box was on the house back in that town that had rejected me. But that's just kind of who my mom was, practical and helpful to the very end. But with my mom's passing, I started to view that place differently. It's the place where my mom and dad chose to spend their final years together. Walking on the beach, watching the most extraordinary sunset over an abandoned paper mill, I found forgiveness. That town had also been abandoned when the natural resources that had once sustained it ran dry. That town also lashed out in anger. That town was me and was a part of me. And although it may seem strange to end the story here in a place that caused me so much pain, it's just another place where I learned to thrive in contradiction. That town rejected me for being Asian American. Yet it is in that place that I first learned that I'm both Asian and American. That town set out to make me fail, and yet it drove me to succeed. That town lashed out in anger against me, yet it is in that place where I finally learned to let my anger go. I have made peace with that place. I have claimed it as part of my identity, and I have reclaimed it as the place I call home. Thank you.